Hello, good to be with you. This is the Created Souls podcast, and I have a special episode today as there was a recent article written just a few days ago on July 29th, I believe it was, in the magazine Mere Orthodoxy. Mere Orthodoxy, July 29th, 2024, entitled Queer Theory as Actualized Cartesianism. Queer Theory as Actualized Cartesianism by Seth Troutt, a pastor and scholar who argues, who makes a quite, you might say, a damning argument against Cartesianism or Descartes himself. And uh, as the title suggests, it's quite a provocative title. Um, so we're going to talk about this. So Seth Troutt, as you can look him up and you can look up this article, you may have to sign in to get it, is the teaching pastor at Ironwood Church in Arizona. He's done some doctoral work on digitization and the bodily self concept. And he advances a position um, or a he makes some claims about Cartesianism that it kind of fits with the sort of you might say the slide today, enhanced by kind of technology into this kind of pluriform sense of identity as a kind of um, degreed, you might say, degreed reality. In other words, there is this degreed reality that's given to gender as a concept to individuals um, that reflects the kind of relativized or relativization of our cultural perceptions about gender and the breakdown of the kind of binary, the old binary idea that humans are kind of at some level essentially either male or female, to this more pluralistic conception of gender identity that is predicated in some ways upon the internal ideas, emotions, basically the kind of internalized or subjectivized understanding of those ideas or of those realities, um, which he sees at some level as related to this kind of growing uh, situation or understanding of gender as a kind of social construct itself, but a social construct that we can work with as communities that is ultimately determinative by the internal, the subjective, or what I think or feel that I am is what is determinative here. And so he sees this, Seth Troutt sees this as a kind of parallel to Descartes' dualistic picture of the human that he sees as kind of separating or dividing the reality of the person as a thinking thing, which is commonly expressed, and obviously Descartes uses that term, and the body as re extensa, or the extension, which becomes the primary property. These two things divide up the reality wherein, in light of this hierarchy that Descartes affirms, the soul is higher, more real, so on and so forth by degree, and makes determinate the lower reality, of which the body is, and is less real. And as a result, he argues in various places and ways, less important or less vital or less relevant to the nature of identity itself. But I want to, again, you can look directly at the paper itself, uh, and I'll be referring to it quoting some from it, and you can go look at it yourself and engage with it yourself. But as the title suggests, an already quite provocative title, Queer Theory as Actualized Cartesianism. Whatever is meant by actualized is maybe underdetermined. It's certainly very provocative, and it certainly elicits within this context, within conservative context, conservative Christian context, evangelical context, something has gone awry with Cartesianism. Something is off about Cartesianism. And certainly he's not quiet about that in the rest of his article. But he begins with this, and I think this is his kind of understanding or definition of Rene Descartes' position, which he goes on to offer something of a critique or a concern for the view itself. And he says, this is how he begins. My freshman year of college, I was assigned to read the 17th century work by Rene Descartes, Discourse on Method, the original home of the cogito, I think, therefore I am. The famous cogito, you might say. The thinker was the sine qua non of the person. And he goes on to talk about the cogito, and he immediately claims this. Cogito, while being first and foremost an epistemological tool for Descartes, entails an anthropology that says your body isn't you. It is the container of you. The most you part of you is your thoughts, not your body, end quote. Potentially aside, I didn't like how it could be used to dismiss the unborn or the mentally impaired from full personhood. Beyond simply asking about the ethical implications, I saw it as simply non-functional. People must relate bodily. So this is the first page of his article. This is how it begins. And what I want to say, first of all, is when a scholar begins with the same sentiment and conclusion as he or she had, in this case, he, in freshman year, then there may be some problems. There may be some problems in the reasoning. And I think in this case, there really is. There really are some problems here in the rest of the article. In fact, as we just read, there were serious concerns. This article actually reflects that quite well. This is a prime example of fallacious thinking that reflects really, I hate to be harsh. I'm not usually this direct or harsh, and I'm sure other work is good by him, and I'll say other things that are good and relevant and not to denigrate other work therein. But this reflects a kind of shoddy thinking of a freshman student and his or her early freshman philosophy classes. This is unfortunate. The article itself goes on, it appears fully to be full of quite apparent non sequiturs, poisoning of the well, and straw men. And this is what was published. It's a short read, 5 minutes. You can read it pretty quickly if you get access to it. So this isn't good. Again, this is coming out from Mere Orthodoxy. So in the very beginning, the introduction that I read, where he lays this out, he makes this pretty quick jump from the cogito, I think therefore I am, which is most people who know anything about philosophy, who have taken an intro to philosophy class, know this is attributed to Rene Descartes, the famous Rene Descartes, potentially the father of modern philosophy and massive influence in the history of intellectual thought. But he goes on from this to derive a kind of inference from this epistemological tool of which cogito is. Not to say that there's no metaphysical implications or a metaphysical foundation for that epistemology. I think there is, arguably. But he makes a strong metaphysical claim from it that your body isn't you, it's the container of you. The most you part of you is your thoughts, not your body. And he says, well, this is clearly wrong because any view of the person must be more than it must include the body ethically, it must include the body functionally. Those are all really radical jumps, though, jumps of inferences from his epistemology, Descartes, and arguably, he doesn't spell out the ontology, but arguably from Descartes' ontology. So this is already from the beginning not on a good footing. It's not a good start to an actual argument, whether it's a popular article or an academic article. Now, on the other hand, Trout's article reflects certain common patterns with certain circles that will uh, be attracted to some of the things he's saying, that will be kind of attracted or find appealing, where when he argues that there are certain quote unquote connections, he says, connections between Descartes' view and uh, modern day LGBT queer theory uh, visions or perspectives on the nature of gender and sexuality. There are certain quote unquote connections, but and he uses that word connection pretty early on. In fact, in the uh, third, I believe it's the third page, he uses the word connections. And so he says there are these connections, which he goes on to expound upon between the two. So, yeah, so it's interesting that he makes this sort of argument. It's not that this argument uh, hasn't, this sort of argument hasn't been around as an objection to Descartes, and that it hasn't found some sort of popular footing in some popular discussions, and maybe even certain academic exercises in sociology or psychology that treat Rene Descartes as the kind of whipping boy in all academic disciplines. Certainly there is that, and he's certainly picking up on that. And at first read, he's saying it in a way that at least lends itself to some sort of credibility, as he's apparently an authority, but also, yeah, I mean, he writes in a kind of charming way initially, but then upon the second read, at least my second read, I saw, no, this is not only problematic, it's severely problematic in terms of the development of the argument itself. Certainly, some will be attracted to this line of reasoning, of course, and some already see Descartes or Cartesianism as along these lines as being sort of lending itself in this way, as lending itself to the possibility of some sort of, a queer theory or transgender ideology or something of the sort, of which uh, uh, Rene Descartes probably would find not only uh, radically off base and even repulsive, but as Trout points out in one place, he says, yeah, he probably wouldn't affirm this, but nonetheless, his view lends itself here. Some will obviously find this charming and quite attractive to them. Um, so what he goes on to argue is that there are these technological trends presently that will continue down this line and enhance this sort of divide that Descartes laid out originally, and which fits or connects with, you might say, connects with queer theory or transgender ideology. And certainly, maybe some of his other work on technology is certainly worthy of engaging and thinking about. I think there is something about technology that I resonated with in the article about how it's transformed and changed us. I mean, I think Neil Postman points this out when he talks about the nature of technology in our present society and how it has become a kind of technopoly that has just taken over and determined a lot of our thinking. And that's all fair and certainly relevant and interesting and worth engaging. Um, certainly. And But again, as we look at the first two pages of this article, Troutt makes significant claims that lack certain clear definitions. His reasoning is way too quick. He makes new significant and numerous conflations of terms and concepts that deserve disambiguating and deserve at least some care in terms of laying out what it is that he means by these terms and how it is that these terms have been used in strict and clear philosophical discussions, which he does not do. Again, he begins with Descartes' famous cogito, but he quickly proceeds to describe what many have called strong or radical dualism, a kind of strong or radical dualism, or what some have called, even in the philosophical literature, substance dualism, of which there are two distinct types of property bearers, of which the property bearers of, say, mind and the property bearers of, say, body are distinguishable and carry their own properties. And more centrally, the claim that is fair of René Descartes, as well as many in the Cartesian tradition that follows, is that the carrier of personal identity, although he doesn't say it this way or say it, in fact, this clearly, the carrier of personal identity is primarily the mind or the soul itself. In fact, he equivocates between the notion of thoughts or ideas and uh, 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 the thing that he's talking about. But it's important to point out that, and he doesn't use the term, at least early on that I remember, he doesn't use the term substance dualism, although he does use the more generic term of dualism when he begins on page I think it's the third page, he compares dualism with modern queer theory. And then he proceeds to describe a constructivist view or a social construction view of persons themselves, where he lays out this parallel. And then he moves in more quickly on that page, the third page, to describing the distinction between body and mind, the hierarchy of both, and this hierarchy that's situated in what he claims Descartes as affirming that the mind is more real than the body. In other words, he calls this anthropological dualism, of which, of course, I've argued elsewhere, is the kind of dominant view represented in the wider Christian tradition of which he is affirming. And of course, that this anthropological dualism is most clearly reflected in somebody like René Descartes, who offers some clarity on the distinctions of these terms, as well as later Cartesian thinkers. But he doesn't use the term substance dualism, and I think that's unfortunate because the term needs to be spelled out in order to make more sense of what it is that Descartes and his Cartesians are saying, and uh, and to differentiate that from other dualisms more broadly. This is where the conflation comes in quite commonly. And so we must spell out the terms and the concepts and give clear designations or clear informing content to those designators in order to proceed in the discussion. But he doesn't do that. He sees a split between thinking as an activity and the body. In fact, early on, he says this, and um, but here's where one of the conflations is. There's a conflation between dualism as some kind of ontological reality or substantial reality, where there are these two property bearers. One is the mind, it's a thing that actually has thoughts and has experiences. And then there's a body that has other types of properties that are derivative of, or epistemically, at least at a minimum, derivative from the thing that is thinking and having experiences about the body, his or her body. Um, but that substantial dualism itself does not entail, this is very important, it does not entail a cosmological dualism, as some have proposed, uh, or nor does it suppose or entail a value dualism where there are respective substances that carry more value necessarily than another. And this is not only unclear in his article, it's quite clear that he's conflating these issues and these versions of dualism, of which he does not spell out at all. So we can set aside on page 3 when he discusses, or page 2 earlier, when he kind of quickly talks about the rationalists, of which Rene Descartes would be one, and then he says rationalists being idealists. I'm not sure what he means by idealist. Of course, I've written on idealism in several places, edited a book on idealism, and that is a kind of, without any definition given, it's a generic kind of throw out there that has no doesn't seem to have much of a role or play much of a role in his argument. It's just not clear what he's doing with it or how he's using that term. Um, so he proceeds to describe this hierarchical reality and the reality that there is this kind of split between the soul and the body, or the mind and the body, and strong dualism is reflected in somebody like Rene Descartes, Cartesianism, or even more broadly, substance dualism itself, which I have argued elsewhere is affirmed by the wider traditions, is implicit in much of the Christian tradition, including the Roman Catholic as well as the Reformed Catholic or Reformed Protestant tradition. It is present as it seems to be a necessary inference from the fact of the disembodied intermediate state, and so on and so forth. But that set aside for a moment, he seems to suggest, no, more than that. He more than suggest. He thinks or seems to think that, or state that Rene Descartes created this sort of radical subjectivity that is reflected in um, the uh, the moods, the epistemic attitudes of queer theory or transgender ideology, of which technology, he says, has a role in uh, enhancing that or advancing that thought in important ways, where he makes this claim specifically. Descartes, a Roman Catholic, would likely hear to hate to be associated with this, but nonetheless, his anthropological dualism, aided by technology, opens the door to queer theory. So, whatever that means, I mean, open the door to queer theory certainly doesn't sound as strong as actualized, as he used in the title. Opens the door, that is questionable, and it's questionable because it relies on a certain set of assumptions about the relationship between Descartes' substantial ontology and the relative merit or predication of values given to those substances. That is simply just not clear in his writing, and it's not clear from Rene Descartes that these implications would follow. So it is, again, a non sequitur. Um, so he describes the digital world as being functionally a place of reality that we are operating in. It has degrees of reality, but it's not full reality. And he further describes the state of persons as existing in a kind of false binary and living, as it were, on a spectrum of what is more real or less real, which he sees as consistent with both the hierarchy of Descartes' dualism as well as the understanding that the soul is more real than the body, as it were, because it participates in more reality than the body. But again, this is actually, I think, a confused way of posing or presenting Rene Descartes' theory. Certainly, there is a kind of hierarchy in Descartes that's worth pointing out. But the hierarchy has to be carefully analyzed. Hierarchy itself is not certainly unique to Descartes, nor is it unique to ancient and medieval civilization, or the whole of, or most of Western civilization, nor is it foreign to the Christian tradition. In fact, hierarchy is arguably present there in a variety of ways. Now, specifically in the context of the soul-body relation, where there is a soul-body hierarchy, it does not follow that simply because you affirm that the soul or the mind is in some way higher than the body, it doesn't entail that the body is valueless or that the body is denigrated functionally in practice, or that the body has no value in informing what it means to be a person or what it means to be a human being. That does not follow from Descartes' view or from the Cartesian tradition that follows from him. It simply does not follow. It's simply not true. The whole idea about the mind having some sort of higher order reality, or the mind being the carrier of personal identity, and the mind having certain properties that are distinct from the body, this too, of course, is not unique to Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes himself is arguably already working within a broader tradition consistent with the Christian tradition, going all the way back to Plato and Augustine, where Plato and Augustine affirmed the mental reality as having some priority, certainly in epistemology, and even some priority as centrally explaining the metaphysics of the world. And this really isn't all that foreign to the Christian tradition, minimally when you affirm the fact that at the center of reality, at the center of the causal story of reality, is God himself, which arguably, or who arguably, is a mind who has consciousness, who has awareness, who has the ability to choose, or who has the ability um, to discriminate between different options of creating this world that is created and between creating another world. And within that world, creating different organisms or creating different human beings. So I think it's important to point that out. Descartes has arguably already been situated in this wider Platonic and Augustinian tradition, of which we see quite clearly in some significant historical studies for example, from Stephen Min in his famous Cambridge book, Descartes and Augustine, where he argues that Descartes is just picking up the old Augustinian project in fresh ways, but nonetheless, it's still largely consistent with the Augustinian project. Of course, you can look at the historian Steve Nadler to find this, as well as John Cottingham, where John Cottingham would show a much more functionally integrated view of the soul and body in René Descartes' writings. And others would even argue that René Descartes certainly doesn't have as strong of a separation between soul and body, and certainly that the body is not denigrated in the way that some often attribute to René Descartes. And that certainly, that claim would certainly not be true of contemporary Cartesians today, who would give ample place to the body, not only as functionally integrated with the soul and providing structure for the soul, but as the as significantly valuable to the life of the human person. So while Troutt makes a point about the use and abuse of certain philosophical systems, catered, as it were, by certain groups and disseminated through technology, it doesn't render it, furthermore, not true or render it a bad theory. Certainly, technology, as Neil Postman describes, is in our culture a kind of technopoly. And I think he's right. And there are many dangers here that Troutt is suggesting. But the whole coupling of this idea with Descartes to queer theory, or as the actualization of it, or as the set of ideas that create a culture that lead to queer theory or transgender ideology, is illicit and, again, a non sequitur. When he says, quote, the transhumanism and transgender phenomena share a general disrespect for the authority of bodies to tell the truth about human interaction, end quote. That is just simply ridiculous. Simply ridiculous. These, how he's paralleling these two just simply does not follow from the argument that he has put forward. He states in another place, quote, the convergence of queer theory and artificial intelligence is making Cartesianism great again. But this time, rather than living in the academy, it is living in homes, schools, and the marketplace. The cogito is presently self-actualizing. As cogito ergo sum replaces the imago Dei, that is a pretty quick injection of a new, rich, complex theological topic, of which he's just done some kind of shifty work there. He goes on to say, quote, we trade the plausibility structures of Christendom for bastardized Cartesian thought. Neo-Cartesian dumb, we would call it, end quote. And that's kind of how he concludes his argument. And then he proceeds to give certain implications and applications that follow from that, where he reflects upon Cartesianism as a kind of docetism, a Christological heresy, regarding this idea that Jesus did not truly have a body, but he only merely appeared to be in a body or have a body itself. It's only the appearance of a body, but it's not him. He's, again, in making this Christological claim, he's conflating several terms and concepts that cannot be, should not be conflated. And then he proceeds to say the Gnostic disdain for the flesh derives from this rationalization of Cartesianism. That is, it's not to say that there's no critiques of Cartesianism, where there's true or not, or maybe there's more sophisticated theological critiques of Cartesianism, but Troutt is not making it. He is simply not making the argument. It does not follow. The whole article is a massive non sequitur. And he begins by poisoning the well against Cartesianism, especially in his circles, where conservative and Christian evangelical Christians are already opposed to queer theory. So that in itself, he goes on to describe a second implication about our anthropology from Christian theology. He says, we must, quote, we must root our anthropology in the physicality of the imago Dei, end quote. He is making another massive jump of inference. Actually, he's just smuggled in this idea about the imago Dei as being physical, but it's not even clear what he means by that. Is physicality necessary, essential to the imago Dei? Certainly, physicality is important to the imago Dei. Most contemporary Cartesians would say that. Certainly, Christian Cartesians would say that. And it's not inconsistent with the Cartesian anthropology of today that we would say that the imago Dei is physical in some form or fashion. That's a much more complicated discussion. But it doesn't also rule out the fact that the mind or the soul itself takes some priority in personal identity, or even some priority in how it is that we understand the whole human project in creation regarding the intents and purposes of the imago Dei as, say, experiencing God, experiencing the presence of God, seeing God himself in and through our soul eyes, or in and through our intellectual eyes, as many theologians in the tradition would affirm, including Thomas Aquinas. So it's just not clear what he's saying beyond. It's not clear what he's arguing beyond this sort of minimal fact that physicality is important to the imago Dei, so on and so forth. But that doesn't do anything for him in terms of making good on the claim that Cartesianism denigrates the body, holds no place of value to the body, that in this further jump to the imago Dei, that there is no place for the body in terms of the imago Dei on a Cartesian understanding, so on and so forth. The paper is simply riddled with rational problems. Third, he goes on to say, this is another application. We must celebrate the sacraments and do so eschatologically. Okay, that just sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo. And it doesn't go against anything that a Cartesian might hold, especially when you understand that the whole sacramental frame and universe that came before René Descartes held to a kind of hierarchy that did give some precedence to the intellectual, the spiritual itself, as somehow at least distinct from physicality, albeit the physicality is still real and something that we experience and we participate in. There's value there. And it's by way of these types in sacrament that we experience the reality of God himself, which is, or who is, a spiritual being, not himself a physical being in a strict or any obvious way. So he goes on to say, quote, the physicality of the sacraments and the synchronous bodily context of the sacraments reminds us of the physicality of God's salvation, end quote. Interesting, he puts it that way. For God himself is not physical. Certainly he takes on physicality in the incarnation as the second person of the Trinity, but he himself is not physical, nor is he himself embodied, at least on any understanding of traditional Christian theology, codified in the Nicene tradition and expressed in the three major subtraditions of Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, or Reformed Christianity, or Protestant Christianity. It's just not the case. Um, there's more that we could expound on here or analyze and take apart, but he ends on this um, kind of underwhelming, exuberant note. Fourth and finally, fourth and finally, live with gusto in the real world, as if um, the belief and the idea that we are fundamentally or primarily at our core souls, immaterial substances, minds, as it were, um, is not living in the real world. I think presumably what he means by the real world is the really physical and earthly reality of the view of the embodied self at creation, which he's pointing to, of course, and he picks up when he describes the nature of man's eschatological end as being the resurrection, which itself, once again, does not undermine Cartesianism, does not make it not true, uh, and certainly doesn't render it an irrelevant or insufficient anthropology for making sense of Christian doctrine, of which many throughout Christian tradition were Cartesian or similar to it when we look back at someone like Augustine. But we also might point back to someone like John Calvin, who John Calvin himself affirmed a more Platonic view in the Institutes, and who does place a hierarchy on the soul. But he says that the Imago Dei still has a place for the body, that the body still participates in reality, that the body is important to the soul, but that cannot go against or minimize the reality that we are primarily souls or immaterial things, and that there is a place given to the soul that is distinct from the body when we are conceiving of the image of God concept. So again, Troutt, you have gotten Cartesianism wrong, certainly. You've probably almost certainly gotten Rene Descartes wrong throughout. Um, and this kind of, it's hard to know this kind of full-throated notion that Cartesianism actualizes queer theory, or you might, maybe it's this idea that Cartesianism not only opens the door, but in opening the door, queer theory becomes a reality or actualized within this sort of um, perspective on the soul-body relationship. So I just want to repeat again that given all that's said here and given what's argued in his piece, the Mere Orthodoxy piece, um, on Descartes' queer theory and Freshman writing in Troutt, he ends where he kind of begins, and he represents a piece of Freshman writing that does not do justice. In fact, it does a real injustice to the whole discussion, to Rene Descartes, as well as to the Cartesian Christians that follow in his stead. And I think this is unfortunate